Okay, so today we're talking about the Team Human podcast, which is, I think it's titled the authenticity or the commodity of authenticity. Yeah. So I have a couple of questions to throw out to you guys, but first, before we do that, first reactions. Davina?
Okay. Yeah. I love the podcast because these are questions that I've been thinking about myself, and it's great to have someone just, talk about them so freely. And so these are things that you grapple with, not trying to, you're trying to find terms that you can use for these things. And then they just, why it's such a free flowing discussion. They, of course, go here and there, digress a bit through the podcast, which is good because I do that a lot. But I think a few things were very interesting for me coming from India, because these things have started to happen here as well. The trolls and the YouTubers, and you often look at the content of these YouTube channels, and you feel like, I don't understand why this person has these many subscribers. What's going on in this content? Why do people like them so much? And I mean, I was talking to young people in the age group of 10 to 18 in Ahmedabad city. So Ahmedabad is like this metropolis city in the western part of India. Some of these YouTubers are really popular among these young children. And when I ask them what it is, it's largely boiling down to relatability and how they put the fun element in, or how they joke about certain things that these young people live every day, and how they get to laugh about these things. So it's like, yeah, this has happened to me too, and haha, you're making a joke out of it. This is fun. So yeah, I mean, it was, I just thought of a few projects that I could do just based on this podcast. Okay, that's me.
I was thinking also about that, about how popular certain YouTubers are. I was wondering how they, and I know that the podcast talked about it, but the benefits of the algorithms. And so if the same YouTuber keeps popping up when you open up YouTube, you're more likely to click on it.
Good, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They don't touch on that a whole lot, but that is a great observation. So we're doing first impressions, right, Sam?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, so I've known Jamie since he was a grad student, and Doug since he was a young superstar. So he's always a superstar, but he was young when I first met him. So of course I appreciated the very playful, conversational, loose, unstructured style of it, and that recreated the feeling of hanging out with them, which was the very phenomenon they were talking about. So I thought that was interesting. But
yeah, I'll second that. I love Doug, so everything he writes interests me, and I love listening to him. That's even more fun. So yeah, it was very, very entertaining beyond its content, and kind of self-evident in the way it was presented.
Yeah, hearing him try to imitate the schwa was hilarious.
I like they came back to that at the end, right? And
yeah,
and started going off on that. But I was surprised that they didn't get as self-aware about podcasts, sort of what you're intimating there, Renee, about how that's really that authenticity of people just talking as who they are, their curious selves, is something that is what sells podcasts or gets audience in podcasts. My reaction, I was thinking immediately, when anytime authenticity is core to the subject, I think about music, and just sort of that being a dividing line between music. A lot of people that I hung out with growing up liked or didn't, was whether they thought somebody was authentic or not. And I thought what was really interesting in first blush in this to me was I couldn't figure out what Jamie was zeroing in on about what authenticity he was talking about at first, and then what seemed to be peculiar to the YouTubers he was studying was this idea that they were creating something that would be identified as authentic. I was surprised they didn't use the word real or 100% at some point, like, or for real, like they didn't use those other vernacular versions of authenticity, but they, that idea of that they got to was that the YouTubers didn't have anything else. There was no other content that they were, was a big point and a big differentiator, was like, this was purely, we need to, what Davina called relatability, some aspect of authenticity that exists in the absence of having any other clear value in what you are creating, right? Like, and Doug sort of got in on like, oh, well, this YouTuber knows about, he's a filmmaker, right? So he can talk about those things. He can be authentic when he talks about a camera getting results or whatever. But it seemed like they were zeroing in on this idea of authenticity in the, that was completely built around persona.
Right. Right. Okay, so while we're kvetching then on what was annoying and what we didn't like, right?
Wait, did I say?
Yeah, I got your critical point. That was good.
I wasn't critical. I thought it was interesting.
So I was frustrated pretty much for the entire show, in part because there wasn't any framing around how, like, this is a conversation that's been going on for 2,000 years, right?
Word.
Rooted in rhetoric. We in the field of rhetoric, we use the term ethos, right? And I felt like, you know what? The Greeks helped us a lot to understand this concept, and to have it like act as if it's like a phenomenon of YouTube. It's like ridiculous. And I was also frustrated by, so this traditional framing of ethos, right, as the rhetorical power, the social power of your personality, right? So that often gets framed in relation to two markers of credibility, right? Authority and authenticity. And I felt like, in a way, I can't talk about authority without talking about authenticity. I can't talk about authenticity without talking about authority. It's like they're like a yin and yang of ethos. So I felt like you said something like they muddied the waters. I felt like at the end of the hour, I had less clear understanding of how I would, and I guess I'm speaking as a media literacy educator, how I would teach about this topic. And so I feel like it was a great conversation, but it didn't give me any insights to help me teach about authenticity, authority, and ethos. And that's, I guess, maybe my motivation for everything in life. So just saying.
They just left the discussion with talking about critical thinking, where how these YouTube content creators are only performing, and they want you to dumb down everything to just viewing and not thinking about anything. And then that's it. They didn't talk about the details of why critical thinking is important and how you can dismantle a certain YouTube performance using critical thinking.
Or how hard it is to engage in critical thinking with characters and personalities that you feel emotionally connected to. It's actually easier to deconstruct something, you know, far away, right? Something you don't have a connection to. And it's really hard when that performativity and identity stuff activates feelings like this is your friend. Then it's really hard to engage in critical thinking. And I'm watching my students struggle with it right now. It's challenging.
Which is why perhaps YouTubers like the ones that they mentioned have followers, right? Subscribers, right? So, I mean, I'd like to believe that I'm not racist, that I'm not a Nazi, but then I relate so much with that particular YouTuber. I forget the name of the woman, but I mean, I don't know how to not call myself a Nazi and still be her subscriber. So you know what? I don't agree to your definition of a racist Nazi fiend, and I'll just go ahead and call you wrong because I'm not critically thinking about it.
Mm. Mm.
I think there are a couple of important teaching points, and you know, their podcast isn't actually about media literacy in all fairness, but you know, of course, like this whole like crafting your personality for the desired effect is definitely not new. We do it in person, just like you're saying, Renee. But I think what's interesting is like when you combine that with the ability to measure an audience in some sort of meaningful way, that's the part that makes it like, oh, like that's what's teachable for me. So my big question is, how do we take that connection, that this advancing technology and the ability to measure us? And I kind of think of this as almost like two parts of the same podcast episode, like part one being about YouTube and how YouTubers are using, you know, human, I guess basically the human machine to measure and respond to audience response. And then part two, AI doing the same thing, right? But also measuring our human, which is terrifying. So I think those two things, like measuring the audience and monetary gain, are the two things for me that as an educator, I want to really dig into and pick apart. And those are the teachable moments, because that's where the consequence lies, right? What do you guys think about that?
So one of the questions that a lot of young people ask me and other people who are researchers or teachers, how do I become an influencer? Because they know that I can get money by becoming an influencer or a YouTuber. So I guess what you asked about monetizing, I mean, the first thing that I think of when they ask me is, well, you know what? This is the future economy, and it's not so bad if you want to learn how to earn money by using this platform. But then again, do we really think we are ready to use this platform and earn money? Because if you're just in it to earn money, you will just do anything and everything to sell whatever sells. Like, for instance, people who go on reality television, and I'm sure that when they're signing the contract, they're really happy about it because they're getting a big contract with a big network. But it's only after they're in the cesspool that they realize they probably made a mistake. Sometimes they don't even realize that.
So I immediately went to my nothing new under the sun place that I always go to when I'm looking at media literacy, and I thought about the podcast that we did a few years ago about YouTube cult, where we connected it to religion, and I thought about I also thought about how throughout history, like advertising, taking advantage of children, etc., that we always had a way of identifying it, and our kind of our inner moral parents stepped up and took control of it. I guess my question now that might actually be something new and different is it growing too big to control? And as they were talking, I was thinking, you know, is when they were saying, you know, when AI is emulating reality and reality is emulating AI, can we see that anymore, or is it growing too big for us because it's happening so fast and it's so large? So I don't know. Maybe it's not, and I hope it's not. But
I perked up. So Frank, that makes me think of agency. They got to agency at one point in the podcast, and I kind of perked up because it's something that I've been working on conceptualizing within media literacy, and they like used a really narrow band of the idea of agency, and almost sort of like as something they were critiquing just about the monetary piece as well. And even if, like you mentioned, how students would ask about that, people sort of popularly thinking of money as the piece of agency itself. But you know, I think agency as refusal or or subversion is often like is a lot about what these people started with, right? So one of the things that's a marker of their authenticity is the flaws, right? One of the things is the stream of consciousness. One of the things is the I don't care if I mess up, or I don't care if I'm this, or I don't care. And so there's a subversion that I think it also will play into the AI, and that people will always be attracted to doing something new and different to subvert the expectations of the algorithm and create some sort of thing that gets hits that wasn't there before. Like think of Visco Girls. Who would have predicted that like that would be a hit last summer? You know what I mean? Like and there it is. Like it happened, and it's still happening, and there's tweens that like can't get out of that character. But like I think that's an agency that would be interesting to look at within this. I also really perked up when they started talking about the Vine migration to like when Vine stopped and they YouTube absorbed that, changed the algorithm. So like those moments of just awareness of the algorithm change in the community, as well as the idea of the aesthetic. So like Jamie mentioned Benjamin in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. That was one of the fewer like idea references of long established ideas that was made during the podcast. But I was thinking of the theory of remediation that Bolton and Hewson, I think I got that right, Bolter and Hewson, around 2000 worked on, where it's the idea that all old media is remediated in new media, but not just all the old media, but all the discourses of media. So like that doesn't mean they're reproduced exactly the same, but there's a reproduction of not just the forms of painting within film, but also the gaze, those sorts of things. And I feel like that was at play in this conversation with the bit about Vine being absorbed by YouTube. It's not just the bit about the algorithm, but it's also about the values, and it's about like the short video versus the longer uncut video, and those kinds of things that make it really interesting and make YouTubers. And they were talking about a lot about passive consumption, but they didn't acknowledge the fact that a lot of people are looking at this, even if they're not ever going to be a YouTuber on that scale or that level of consistent production, they're looking at copying the moves, right? Like your influencers, Davina, are looking at copying the moves of the influencers. And that's critical thinking, that imitation, not critical in the most critical sense that we think of it for critical change in that sort of agency, but in terms of basic thinking about techniques, about how you're producing your message, that level of imitation, you're like looking at who are the people I love and how do I want to use that to create my own persona, whether it's really fully conscious or not.
I'm not sure exactly if I follow if that is critical enough. I think that's just the way to rig the system in your favor. Isn't that right? I mean, I understand what you're trying to say when you say that there's a certain amount of critical thinking that goes into building a persona by doing, those A to Z things. But I mean, I wonder, because when I think of critical thinking, I think of using certain concepts and processes to be able to break apart and see the underlying power structures and see how that is influencing my decision. Is that what they do here?
Yeah, that's what I meant by critical. That's critical studies in our fields. I think in the education field, critical thinking is less politicized in that way, and we can think just about the construction without necessarily thinking about the power. And I don't believe that that's complete. There is a distinction, though. I think those are different discourses.
So Michael, I just want to react to your point as well, because you had a lot of ideas going on in there. I really agree with you about your optimism around transgression as an aesthetic and human creativity as constantly, you know, reinventing. So you're optimistic that the algorithm won't swallow up humanity because people will keep using the power of creative transgression to game the system. I thought that was a really great point. And I also thought there was another a moment of optimism in your observations about remediation and algorithms, and kind of how I interpreted that was, well, could be fearful about algorithms, or in the spirit of remediation, you could think about algorithms are like another ratings. I mean, Nielsen ratings are to algorithms as, you know, what is to what, right? So measuring audiences is essentially the business model for all media that uses the indirect revenue stream, selling audiences to advertisers. And I don't have the same fear about algorithms, because I think of it in relation to this older media, right? The ratings measurement systems that were the backbone of how the industry, you know, commodified attention. So that's something I think they wanted to talk about that, and I just didn't feel like it. I wanted to draw the threads between that and this idea of performativity, because what I think is interesting about authenticity is how authenticity is now a performance, right? So, and that the irony of that is just makes me crazy, but I'm fascinated by that. And that's clearly what YouTubers are learning to exploit for ratings. They're performing authenticity.
And I think, so like what you're saying, Renee, about this being similar to like Nielsen ratings, for example, like, yes, and it's more intense, right? Because it's not like Nielsen is like a generalization and it's not totally accurate. This is like 100% accurate. And even more than that, like if people can tell it, so like the episode itself kind of graduated into a whole other level, right? So like starting off talking about YouTubers and how YouTubers are just looking at the audience feedback via the algorithm of their live viewing is one thing. Like that's already a lot more dialed in and effective, right? And it's only looking at their exact audience. Like if you're not part of the audience, you're not part of this data, right? So then graduating to AI, where they're actually measuring your facial expressions and your tics, your attention, like, I think that's just like, yes, it is like the same, it's the same measurement sort of, but it's like on steroids, and it's, I don't know.
I like how they use the analogy. I like how they use the analogy of drugs, LSD and Prozac. That's exactly it. And I mean, you know, you were talking about not being so worried about algorithms, but I don't get that. Because, I mean, YouTube's, is she the CEO right now or what? Susan Wojcicki? I mean, she's worried about algorithms. So, and it's like a big task for her to manage day to day on which ones to run and which ones to shut down. And she's shutting down more algorithms every single day because they throw up crazy stuff. So for instance, children, there'll be these weird videos that will show up in their feed because of a certain algorithm tweak. And they're not supposed to be watching those videos, allegedly.
Yeah, so the idea of that gaming the system, right? That YouTube changes the algorithm every day, but users, this is Michael's point, I think, users figure out by looking at their own data how to exploit that. You know, one of the best examples of that is David Dobrik, right? The guy, the Viner, who then, you know, turned his Vine fame into YouTube fame, right? And he did it by looking really carefully at which videos got watched and how long that he used the data to inform his creativity. And what looked like really authentic, spontaneous right? Videos were actually really crafted in relation to the data from his audience. And I think maybe that's the part of that's the part of the podcast that I guess I experienced. So because I know both of these guys and love both of these guys, I, as a listener, felt really dialed into that conversation. It was like they were right here in my kitchen, right? And I feel like that, symbiosis between the audience and the author, right, is something that is further enabled by all kinds of technologies, including data. Data helps me better understand which pages on my website are getting popular. And it's mind-boggling to me, right? But I feel like that could help me be a more effective communicator if I use it wisely.
But on the user end, like, isn't the power of that a little bit skewed, right? Like, as a user, oftentimes, of course, we don't know that that's happening, and we don't know how to use that to our advantage. I mean, at some point you can kind of put two and two together, like, oh, I've been watching a lot of Saturday Night Live clips and that's what's being fed into my YouTube. But like, aside from that, like, as users, you're actually very, very much on the low end of that power structure.
It's interesting sometimes when creators are choosing not to worry about certain things and just be true to their message. Like, I'm a big nerd fighter, so I've been listening to John and Hank Green for years, and Hank actually talked about how the algorithms are changing and they're not getting the young user base that they did 5 or 10 years ago, and partly that's because they're not publishing as much YA stuff as they used to, and they're just doing, their message has changed a little bit as they've gotten older, and they're being true to who they are, but they're also, like, they've decided that they're just conversations between each other that they've shared with everybody. They're not changing that, even though the algorithm's not supporting them getting more and more popular with that. They've changed so that now Crash Course is what they really want to, promote, and their conversations, it doesn't matter to them that they're not growing anymore. And I think that that's kind of important for authenticity, is for the producers to actually decide what it is that matters to them in the algorithms. Is it just popularity, or are they trying to dial into a specific audience?
Really great.
They're essentially growing up with their audience is what they're doing. And I mean,
yeah.
So for me, again, the commodity of authenticity is also about, so these guys are authentic to themselves and their audience, right? Versus the performance that these other YouTubers put up by using data. So I wonder how long they'll remain their authentic self. I mean, one day they'll wake up and watch their own videos like, who is that person?
Definitely.
Well, it also, I mean, that all speaks to, like, I mean, like John Green, for example, is probably not reliant on YouTube for, his mortgage payment, right? So, the pressure to monetize, or like that incentive to monetize, is probably not as strong there, right? Like, his incentive is something else.
So I'm haunted regularly by an incident in one of my classes in 2011 when I was, we were using Doug's book, Program or Be Programmed, that semester. And we were talking about the book, The Filter Bubble, which had just come out. And I asked my students how many of them knew that the Gap ad on their Facebook was not an accident. And the haunting reply was, what's wrong with that? It makes it easier for me. And that was new to me. And maybe it was just new to me. Maybe that's always been there, but I had never sensed that it was ever okay before that moment with anybody. And I thought,
go ahead, Frank.
I just was wondering if there was a new culture emerging from all of this, or not.
Yeah, I had that. I get haunted by a conversation I had with a guy at a wedding in like 2002 who was talking about that kind of social media niche marketing design that he was working on, and excited for just that reason, like genuinely thinking like, well, why wouldn't you want this? And I, was a high school teacher teaching 1984 and Brave New World and dystopian novels at the time, and going, I wonder what could go wrong with that. And yeah, it's a moment that I think of all the time with that sort of piece. Yeah, I hear you.
And I also think we also have a population of educators that are undereducated themselves and don't know what they're dealing with, so they don't know how to teach it. And I mean, we have this wonderful piece of paper that goes out there once called the crap test, and then everybody knows everything they need to know about if anything's authentic or not, and everybody's empowered. And I'm like, God help us, so there's a lot there for me to kind of unpack, to figure out if it's everything under the sun or something new.
Yeah, I'm a bit confused by this conversation and their conversation. I understand. It's just my idea of authenticity and how authenticity is performed. I've never, it's been a long time from a kid who grew up on heavy metal and punk music. The performance of authenticity has always been like a thing that was something to play with, to joke about, to pose in, to be ironic about, and to trash. And like that idea of performance, I think also in queer communities, has for generations been something that, authenticity is performative. It's about being comfortable in the persona that you're living at the moment, whether that's in this space or that space, code switching, all these different pieces that we think about in relation to authenticity. And now we're shunting in algorithms because they're for real in this context of certainly the portrayal of authenticity, which is spectacular because of the lack of other kind of hooks that we can sense, perhaps, which is where they started the conversation. And, when I brought up remediation, I hadn't really thought about what Renee started talking about in Nielsen ratings and data being remediated. But I feel like big data is it's almost like the electronic, somebody brought up McLuhan, but almost like the going from the analog to the electronic age. Like the big data age seems like it doesn't have something it's remediating in the other way that our other media are, in this way of analyzing such mass audiences. Mass audience being something the individual user and creator has the ability to mobilize, and to have what a boardroom of producers had access to in terms of data projections from Nielsen ratings, a few decades ago. So that concept of authenticity and performativity being affected by that totally new and different aspect is sort of really hard to predict what relationship or even observe. And in this case of YouTube seems pretty rare and fleeting to me, in that respect.
So that's a really great point. But I do feel like the difference between, there's the reason maybe why I'm not so fearful. I'm not as fearful as the age of surveillance capitalism lady, right? Because these tools are available to everyone, right? So I can go on my YouTube channel and see exactly how many seconds, minutes people watched, which videos they watched, which videos are most popular, when people stop watching. I can see what geographical regions. Go India. So thank God I have a lot of viewers in India and the Philippines. And I've never even been to the Philippines, right? So the fact that I can access these tools just the same way that John and Hank Green can is actually better than the bad old days when only CBS, NBC, and ABC could gather data on ratings, could gather data on audiences. And I feel like in some ways, part of what we're seeing in YouTube culture right now is YouTubers are adjusting their authentic performances in relation to the data that they have access to. And yes, it's tremendously troubling and distorting, and in a way it makes transgression as an aesthetic an unbelievable thing. Just an example, so this week I am grading my students' Leap 1s, and their Leap 1 is called Ordinary Creativity. They were to pick a YouTuber, an Instagrammer, or a TikToker and make a 5-minute screencast critically analyzing their work. Well, boy, have I been surprised by their choices, okay? Including this hot mess, okay? This woman was demonetized on YouTube and disinvited to VidCon because, well, just like, look, she's falling apart online. Like, she's a mentally unstable person who is displaying her mental illness, and it has become a form of entertainment, right? And this has happened throughout the history of American entertainment culture, going all the way back as well, right? There's nothing new about this. Hollywood took mentally unstable girls and abused them. Well, you know, Marilyn Monroe being the most, you know, obvious example. So there's nothing really new about it either, but the fact that this mentally ill girl is adjusting her performances of her mental illness in order to maximize the audience size, in order to monetize her mental illness, is transgression as aesthetic on steroids.
Also,
and that scares me. That scares me.
So also, when you say that big data is pretty, it's pretty, yes. Algorithms are pretty too, but they're only as pretty as we make them out to be. And I mean, imagine, say, for instance, my perspective. So if I were in the USA, as a person of color, I would be afraid of the algorithms and the big data that they're generating on persons of color and how they're using that against us, right? So whether it's airport security or whether it's certain kinds of media framing, which I think to a certain extent the podcast also spoke about, it can be quite racist.
Yeah, I wonder, like, as you're saying, Renee, that like this technology gives us all a voice, basically, or all a megaphone. That's so great. And it's so, I mean, I'm not saying anything new, and they did talk about this a lot in the podcast too, but I mean, that can be dangerous, right? Like, it depends on what your message is. And, you know, we don't have a gatekeeper anymore, and we have to be our own gatekeepers. And most of us are not equipped to do that, or, you know, understand what's important in those gatekeeping decisions. So yeah, I don't know. I will say, like, the podcast promised to talk about the promise and perils of this technology, and I don't think they talked that much about the promise. Actually, they talked about the initial promise of YouTube and how that has disappeared practically, and then pretty much the rest of it was peril. And it spoke to me because I'm kind of minded to think about those aspects anyway, but I would have liked more to hear about like some of these more positive aspects. And I wonder, Renee, you brought up a lot of really great examples. What are some of the others?
So what about their whole rant on VR? Were you compelled by that at all?
Well, I'll say that we haven't talked about it much. So, and I wonder too, I mean, that's kind of the story with VR, like people outside of the tech world or outside of, you know, those of us who are following this are not talking about VR. And part of it is that it's not actually reality for most of us yet, right? So it's not something that, you know, the general average person is utilizing on a daily basis like YouTube is. So at some point, I think it will become part of the conversation. But as of right now, what they said is really important. Like what they talked about, I think is really important, but it's almost like a bit abstract still.
Yeah, it's hard to know what to make of it yet because it's still expensive and it's limited on what you can actually do with it. And you spend a lot of time running into walls because it makes you unable to see your local surroundings, and you're corded to, I guess some of them might be wireless, but the ones I've tried have been wired to something. So, you know, you take 2 steps away and you're already having problems. And even playing games, you're swinging your arms around and like, oh wait, there's the coffee table, whoops. But even VR games, there just aren't very many options yet. Like my brother has a VR game system and he has like 4 games, and one of them is really good and the other ones are not so good. So I think it's still sort of, there's a lot of promise there, but because it's still really hard to make them and they're still sort of figuring out what to do with it. Like I know that there are people trying to do VR films, but just the process of filming something that, if you're going to let your audience choose, you've got to give them a lot of choices, and to do 360-degree environment and make it at all real, that's huge. That's like an enormous amount of work and data, way beyond what they would film for a Hollywood movie, which can take years to draft and get funding for and film and edit and actually promote and get out there. So a VR movie, I mean, it's we're getting there, but we're not there yet. So it's hard to know what to make of it.
I found with the conversation around VR that one, I wish they had talked more about it. I was intrigued by that part. But the other thing is I started to wonder, what are the plans with VR, and or are there any plans? I mean, is this another thing that's just going to take off and we don't know what will happen?
So I actually came across Professor Ashish Kumar's work. He works at Hofstra University, and he was there at the Department of Communication, University of Hyderabad, which is where I'm doing a PhD from, to talk about just that. So he was talking about augmented realities, where he spoke about VR, AR, and MR. And he said that one of the biggest things that VR is looking at, or rather MR more so, is trying to get people who are using it to get an understanding of empathy, maybe, for instance. So one project that I think I'm not sure if he was involved with the project or if he just came across it, but this was built by a migrant programmer who essentially used this little application that you download on your phone, and you can use your phone to look at how a migrant would go through the entire journey of leaving his or her country and getting to a safer place where they could cross the border. And I mean, that was incredible. And then there was another project that they were talking about to sort of make us aware of how our data is used to personalize and customize what we are using, what we're seeing, what we're doing online. So empathy is one thing, a greater sense of awareness. The light bulb moment is another thing that they're trying to do using VR. But my question is, if the technology becomes as easily available as the smartphone, I wonder how much impact it will still have. to make people innately aware or empathetic about their surroundings, because then it becomes just another thing that they're looking at. They get desensitized to it. Or for instance, I am feeling it till I have my VR headset on. Once it's off, I'm back to my reality.
So as you were describing that, Davina, I was thinking about like, there's a fundamental issue about like persuasion and manipulation, right? And so like you just described a really beautiful use of those types of coercion, I guess, or I guess coercion is not, you know, necessarily the right word, but everyone's definition of that is different, right? Like the Nazi lady that they talked about in the podcast, like her plight is just as noble as, you know, the plight to understand migrants' experience. And, you know, at some point, I don't know, there's no answer to this. I just think it's kind of an interesting little loop to think about, like everyone's definition of okay is different, right?
I've been really fascinated about how the VR, so the VR conversation's been going on for like 20 years, right? And it's never taken off commercially. And I've been really fascinated at how academics get used, I think, in this conversation, because there are positive applications of virtual reality, right? But the business model will be shoot 'em up games. Okay, just the same way with the video game industry. Yes, there are altruistic video games that teach about the plight of refugees. The UNHCR, you know, shows you can use a video game to sort of discover what it's like to be an immigrant, right? Seeking asylum. But the whole industry, so academic projects like that, which kind of say, oh yeah, video games can be good, actually are very helpful for the industry to create these first-person concepts that make millions, right? But then when they get criticized, they can point to those good examples that the academics do. And so I actually feel like there's, because of the point that Katie made about the cost of these things, then that's where I am concerned about power inequalities, right? Because everybody can make a YouTube video, but not everybody's going to be able to make a VR game, right? And or a video game. And that's where the power inequalities become more problematic.
So I just want to just respond to that a little bit, because I think back to, like, you know, the early to mid 2000s when we didn't have enough bandwidth for YouTube to make a YouTube video, and they restricted us to 5-minute videos, like in the second half of the first decade of 2000s, that we grew into the power to be able to. So I'm not sure if you're going to be right about that with VR, if we're going to grow. I get your point about how they exploit us, and I get that part, but whether or not we will have the power to actually use it is yet to be seen, because of the way things have been growing exponentially, you know?
Another tangent that I wanted to talk about through the video or through the podcast was, they spoke about how Trump is like the meme lord. And immediately what struck to me was how Modi could be the troll lord. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India. The reason being, you know, we talk about how these mediums are free and for the public, and what we have instead is on Twitter and Facebook, scores and scores of people literally being paid in rupees or being swindled by ideology, who work on behalf of the so-called IT cell, and flood the system with a certain kind of narrative, which makes the country believe that we are a right-wing nationalist country, and that's what we have to support. And protesters are people who are being paid, and they have no scruples whatsoever. They'll stay and protest today because they're being paid. Tomorrow when the payment stops coming, they'll stop protesting. And it's now bordered on violence, where protesters are being attacked. We just had a major mob clash in Delhi, which is, I mean, it's part of the capital region. And I'm not sure if I'm all that hopeful about the emancipatory nature of these kind of platforms. I mean, I'm not sure. I feel like money can lead you to buy these so-called free media as well.
Great point. It's kind of scary to see the very same paradigm rolling out all over the world, right? But it also makes me more hopeful that really that's where media literacy is really the solution, right? Because people don't understand how their individual actions, right, are creating the culture. In your case, the individual spreading for a few rupees, spreading the Modi hate messages is actually creating a distorted understanding of public opinion, right? And I think as people learn to think about their social responsibility more broadly, then, I mean, that's in a free society. What else is there, right? So I don't know. I do worry about the fact that it's quickly the autocrats and the demagogues all around the world have really figured out how to game this system.
So I'm in a somewhat unique position as a middle school librarian, and I am going to, so right now I'm teaching how to use the library and how copyright works, but I need to develop one more course. These are like 7 lessons. So like 7-hour-long lessons for 6th, 7th, 8th graders. And so next year, media literacy is coming on the curriculum. So I've been trying to develop this like 6, 7, 8. It varies depending on what else is happening during this quarter. And so I have a captive audience of tweens and early teens. What would you guys say is an important thing to make sure that I get across to them? Anybody have any ideas?
If the platform is free, you're the product. I think a lot of people, even if they know it, they sort of brush it off saying, oh, so what? Because I'm getting so much in return. And they don't realize.
Yeah, we talked about that when we talked about licensing.
You are the product. That's a big one. What else? Attention, harnessing human attention is a life skill that's important for everyone to learn.
Yep.
What should her 6th, 7th, and 8th graders learn? Mary, Samantha, Frank, Michael?
So much of the material is for older audiences, for university students and adults and, sometimes teens, but very little for these 12, 13, 14-year-olds.
The number 3, I would say, is your individual behavior online has social consequences.
Yeah. Well, they definitely learn a lot about their digital footprint and how important it is not to put stupid things on social media. Whether they actually do that is a whole different question.
Yeah, I was thinking of saying that in just a slightly different way, just that the sort of internet world that they want to be in, they can make by their actions. Like I feel like that's sort of empowering thing, like that. Yeah, the internet is listening to everything you do, and you have a digital footprint, and free stuff isn't free, and all that is very much true. But that also allows them to affect the world and create through their own individual actions, connecting to the communities they want to prosper on the internet. So like that I think is a big thing that middle schoolers can get, because they're pack kids. So
Yeah, and
what
that's why your experience with the Vlog Brothers could be a really cool opportunity to talk about how communities form around shared values. So you use your expertise as a nerd fighter. Bring that into the curriculum. Students don't, like John Green said, he does not reaching 12-year-olds anymore, but your story could be really empowering for 12-year-olds.
Anything
I
that
love this. I
allows
gotta
that
sign off, guys. Bye.
empowered. See you, Mike.
Bye, Mike. Thanks for joining.
I just think with that age group, they often feel so oppressed that anything that makes them feel empowered is a powerful tool to teach them.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this directly related to, well, media literacy curriculum per se, but if they could be a little more kinder online. Because, you know, you realize that you talk to a lot of people and they are needlessly mean online, but then when you meet them in person and confront them, it's like, why did you speak with me like that yesterday on Instagram or Snapchat? They'd be like, oh, no big deal, this, that. And they're like pretty chilled out in person. I wish if they could be chilled out online as well.
Yep, and I would add one more point, which is quality is not popularity. Quality does not equal popularity, and to really distinguish between something that's popular and something that has quality, right? And that's
well, I think the whole
yeah.
Vesco Girls thing has really, I think, shown a lot of the kids that.
Right. Yeah.
So we're at the end of our time, but I want to make space for Mary to add something because it's.
Thank you. I was just thinking about purpose and audience. So you can empower them by thinking about those two things very simply, both as a producer and a consumer. What is the purpose and who is the audience? And that helps on both sides of the coin, possibly.
Yeah. All right. Well, guys, if you have any other recommendations, definitely send them via email and we'll distribute them out to the whole group. Thank you so much for this conversation. This has been great. I didn't even have to use any of my question prompts, so that's awesome. I love when this happens. I will send around the voting form for next time, which is always the same URL, but I'll send it around anyway. And also, if you have any other recommendations for podcasts, we're really thin on audio only options, so please send things. And also, I have a lot of options for things that are like very critically picking apart in a more like perilous way, this technology. And if you have any other recommendations for like maybe how we're using, like how we can be empowered using digital technology or things like that, like from the other spectrum, it might be a good time to kind of shift gears. We've been on this like very hard hitting trend for quite some time now. So if you guys have any like empowering titles that you want to recommend, I'd love to see them. So I think that's it. Thank you all and see you in a month.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Sam, for organizing it. Bye, guys.
Bye. Have a good day, you guys.
Bye.
Hey, Sam.
Yeah.
So you were talking about your PhD and how's it going now? You were talking about a possible road